or my challenge to each of you is to start asking why. And the first why you might be asking is, why another podcast? Why are we talking about women in sport? And, well, I want to give you the reasons why. I started researching gender in sport, and specifically gender equality in sport, some time ago, about 6 or 7 years ago, because I had this wild theory as I completed my MBA. So it actually is quite a long time ago. As I completed my MBA and was thinking about taking on some doctoral studies around creating gender equal workplaces, I thought, you know what, if only business was as inclusive as sport. So my theory was, if only we could get the businesses in Australia to model themselves on the way we do sport in Australia. And then I had a couple of other experiences as a board director and as a contributor to sport. And I thought, hang on a minute, I don't know that my theory stacks up here, so I better actually go and do some research. And I started researching by simply looking around and going, well, hang on a minute. There aren't as many women in sport as I thought there were, and particularly when I talk about sport, I'm talking about the leadership in sport, so at those decision-making tables. So I did a whole bunch of stuff, and then I teamed up with a fabulous woman called Sarah Hudson, who helps me out with research and interviews, and we created a bit of a playbook to say, well, let's figure out what is actually going on in sport, particularly for non-athlete women, and let's give sporting administrators a playbook. So we started and we wrote a report, and that was the Advancing Women in Sport report number 1. And then it went into report number 2, because we wanted to gather the data to start off with to create awareness about the fact that we have some really big gaps in sport. And then we said, well, okay, what does that mean? And what are the attitudes and the sentiments? What do people really think and feel about sport? So we researched, and we did some qualitative and quantitative research with about 1,000 of you from the sporting sector in Australia, and came up with a whole bunch of other stuff. And then we went, well, okay, so statistics are one thing, but who are the people, who are the women behind the statistics, and what are their stories? And we said, right, so the next report, Advancing Women in Sport, report number 3, is going to be stories of women in sport from career start through to the boardroom, because as humans and as leaders in sport, we must be curious, have empathy for and compassion for the lived experience of women in our sporting environments, because they vary greatly. And then this thing happened, the P word, the global pandemic, because Sarah and I were ready to rock and roll with this report. And as 2 years ago, we started to hear about this thing that was coming down like a freight train down the line, we thought, well, okay, this is probably not the right time to release a report about gender equality in sport, because sport was quite literally, and it's no surprise to any of you on the call, sport was quite literally fighting for its very, very life. So we held off, and then we held off, and we thought, well, once this is over and done with at the end of 2020, we'll be right, we'll get it out there. Then 2021 happened. We went, oh, shoot, what are we going to do? And I thought, you know what am I doing a lot of? I'm learning through listening. I love podcasts, and I'm this very late adopter to podcasting. What is this podcast malarkey? But I got onto it. And of course, as those of you who know me, once I get onto something, I'm pretty determined. I'll give it a red hot go. So I thought, hang on a minute. I've got these stories about women in sport. We've got this medium that is so powerful and reaches so many people. Let's do a podcast. And we reworked and re-interviewed these terrific 8 women. Some of them are with me tonight to tell their stories, because women are more than a statistic. We are more than numbers and data, although that's important. So before I start to talk about those terrific stories of the 8 women that I've interviewed for this podcast, I wanted to actually take you back to some statistics, because I've got some new stuff which has just come to light. Well, not just come to light. Yeah, it's just come to light in the last 2 weeks. So I'm going to share at the very heart of why each one of us has to pay attention to women in sport, both on and off the playing field. So let's have a look at what it's like for women in sport right now. I'm going to whip you through. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint, I promise. So, of our very large sporting environment in Australia, 58% of the workers in sport are women. And, pardon me, so more than half are women. However, only 11% of board chairs in sport are women. 29% of board directors in sport are women. The women are the green, in case you hadn't worked that out. I know you're all very bright people. Only 12.2% of CEOs in sport are women. Now, the very first time I presented data like this, that number was 3.7%. So we have made really big gains in literally 6 years. But 12.2% of CEOs, the people in charge of our sporting organisations, are women. 32% of executives in sport are women. Now, hang on a minute. 59% of people who aren't managers in sport are women. So what's going on here? 67% of clerical and admin workers in sport are women. 60% of community workers in sport are women. So what we're seeing here is that power is very much tilted in the direction of men in sport. Now, I will make an aside here. I'm taking a gender binary, a binary view of gender, I should say. So because I don't have data, apart from a very small sample of my own, about non-binary or non-gender conforming people in sport. So for those of you who are saying, well, hang on a minute, what about trans people? What about non-binary? I don't have the data to share with you, so that's why there's a binary view of this. I hope our data sets get a lot better and we can start sharing that as well. So we've got, thinking about gender in a binary sense, we've got a very high number of men represented in the echelons, the highest echelons of sport, and a lot of women overrepresented in the areas where a lot of work is done. Here's the kicker. The gender pay gap that in sport is 27.5% overall. Now, that is compared to 14% for all industries in Australia. So for my overseas friends on the call, I do have Australian data here, so bear with me. But the trends, I imagine, aren't that different over the world. What's interesting about this data, though, is even once women ascend to executive level, there's still a pay gap. At management level, there's still a pay gap. At non-management level, there's still a pay gap. Now, interestingly, at clerical level, there's a negative pay gap, and my formatting hasn't quite come across here, but we actually have a gender pay gap in favour of women for clerical workers. But if you're a community worker in sport, you can experience a 54% gender pay gap. This is data that we just have to pay attention to. And I want all of you on the call, and this data will be available. You actually can look at my socials today because I've published a report with all of these numbers in it, and it's courtesy of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. So I want you to pay attention to this report and think about what those numbers might look like in your workplace, in your sporting environment. So today we're launching this podcast, and we're launching it on or in the month of International Women's Day because, well, for a whole range of reasons. Number one, because it was actually ready now and it made good sense. So there was great timing. But number two, this year's theme of International Women's Day, Break the Bias, is so in sync with the stories that these 8 terrific women have told me about their lived experience in sport. Now, the stories are about good stuff, about bad stuff, and about everything in between. But what underpins the stories of the women in this podcast series in season 1, and yes, there is going to be a season 2, is the fact that bias prevails in all sorts of different ways. So We're launching because we want to break the bias in sport, and every single one of you watching live on the call tonight and today for our friends in the Northern Hemisphere, and for those of you who watch up on catch up later, I want you to, yes, look at the numbers, yes, look at the statistics, because they tell a story, but I want you to listen to the podcast because it tells the stories of women beyond the statistics, and these women are representative of the whole gamut of intersectionalities of women that show up in the sporting arena. So that's why the podcast, and that's why we're doing it now, and that's why we're having a chat tonight. Now, if you want to look at my two reports, the existing Advancing in Women in Sport reports, this is where you can get them. Pretty much just Google Michelle Redfern Sport and you can go to my website if you can't grab the link there quick enough. But if you can go there and have a read of those, well, number one, you'll see the first report. You'll see just how far we have come, because that contains that data where we had very low numbers of CEOs. But have a look, then listen to the podcast, and away we go. So let's hear from, well, let's do something a bit different now. I would like to, well, I guess what I'd like to do now is to call upon my wonderful guests, and but before we do that, Ben, I guess what I want to do is pop something else in for our viewers to have a look at. So, Ben, away we go, and then we're going to bring our guests in.
Michelle is really authentic. She's true to herself, and she's using that passion and authenticity to really try and drive some positive change, both within Australia but obviously internationally as well.
She certainly rolled up her sleeves and got involved in everything and anything that it took to try and assist us. She'll be fully committed and a great ally if you're genuine.
It's equally important to have men and women in that conversation so that we can have a balanced view of whatever the topic or issues that are being discussed. Michelle creates an environment where you can confront some of those hard truths.
Michelle doesn't suffer fools easily. She'll see through any tokenism that might be out there. When you first commence the journey, there's always trials and tribulations, but the long-term goal is certainly worth it.
Michelle's able to surface some of those things and create an opportunity for us to get more women in leadership roles within our sport.
Voices you heard there were Jason Reddick from the Australian rules football industry and the broader sporting industry now. Jason's now with RecLink, and Adam Bishop, who's with Athletics Australia. And the reason I've shared those very nice words that they've said about me, which was lovely, including the fact that I don't suffer fools gladly, is because this is not a women's problem. This is not just women's the women's job to fix, and so often the burden of inclusion is placed on those who are excluded. So men have to come on the journey. You hold power, and you know those statistics are evidence. Men hold power. I want you to do something about it, and I want to be that person along with a whole bunch of other people that can help you do that. It's time to get shit done. Excuse me for the expletive, but it is time to get shit done and start getting some of these terrific women in charge around decision-making tables and helping us to create sustainable, enduring, flourishing, amazing sporting environments where every who can reach their full potential. So with me today in Northern Hemisphere tonight, I should just say with me now, I have 4 of the women who've given me an enormously generous amount of their time and their experiences. And I'm going to ask each one of them as they bring them in to have a chat to introduce themselves. So, but I'll do the honours first. Shelley Ware, Alison Dodd, Hannah McDougall and Emily McKee. And we have a whole range of sports and sectors in sport represented with these women. But let's talk about break the bias, because each one of you, and I know because I've had these conversations with you, each one of you have experienced your own bias, have experienced bias. It's put barriers in your way. And So I'm interested first to throw to Shelley and Emily around that bias, but also, we can't ignore the fact that we are still in a global pandemic, and there have been, I don't want to use the word unprecedented, but I just did, of course, but women have been disproportionately affected in business, but in sport. And we know that bias, by the pandemic, and we know that bias has played a part in that. Shelley, I'm going to throw to you first. What has been your experience of bias, and I guess then that overlay around the pandemic?
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for having me here today. I would say that the biggest problem I've had, and I joke around quite a lot with this, is that I've actually been hit with the double stick in terms of double bias, one being Aboriginal woman and the other being a woman. So for a long time in media, I've worked in AFL media. I don't play sport at an elite level, but I have represented women and their voices in the media for the past 25 years, and 12 of that has actually been live television. So it's been very high paced, very exciting, and then the rest is pretty much made up of newspaper, radio, podcasts, and just the general media side of everything. But within that time, and over again, I would have heard people in high leadership positions tell me that Australia isn't ready to see an Aboriginal person on their televisions on a daily basis. So when I was actually on television, I should have clarified that I worked on an Indigenous network on NITV. And that was what I was told over and over again, that it was okay for me to be there because that's where Aboriginal people are supposed to be, and that I shouldn't leave that network because I should stay where I basically belong, in my box. So that has been something that has been said to me over and over and over again throughout my career. But what I am pleased is that we had the Me Too movement. I was in a very unsafe workplace for women. And so to be able to speak out in the Me Too movement and be able to say, because essentially people started listening, then you back that up with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then people wanted to listen even more. So through these global initiatives that have happened around the world and people listening and actually looking at themselves as human beings as well, a lot has changed, I think, for my space and for the space of many others. Chuck in COVID, of course, the first people to go were women in media. So that was hard too, but it also gave me time to reflect, Michelle, upon what I wanted within my own career. And I had spent a lot of time chasing and pushing and breaking down barriers. And what I have seen from Me Too and the Black Lives Matter is that it's worked. They've worked. We are seeing Aboriginal people on televisions every day. And I've just taken away from that, being an old duck now, is that I'm really proud to be a part of that. I'm proud to have been a part of breaking down the barriers and laying the tracks for these people to be able to do what they're doing. So it certainly has had its challenges over the years, and the problems are countless, and it's been unfortunate. But like I said, very proud to have been a part of breaking the bias.
And I think from a timing perspective, it was good that you've reminded us that towards just after the pandemic started was when George Floyd was murdered, and certainly that Black Lives Matter movement came into so many people's consciousness. And I think Australia is often found wanting with our Aboriginal, our First Nations people are over-incarcerated, overly intervened in from social services perspective, yet we see them overrepresented in sport, but not overrepresented in leadership. So we're certainly seeing some interesting work around inclusion. I think it would be remiss of me not to call out Tanya Hosh and the work that she does via the AFL. But I think, Shelley, for you, being that person who has had to both experience the bias, and it is the double whammy. So this is the intersectional stuff. You front up as a woman, as an Aboriginal woman, and now as you call yourself an old duck, please. But maybe there's age there as well. I don't know. But these are the very real stories that don't get picked up in statistics, that we don't hear that. What is that lived experience? So I'm glad that you have been flying that flag and you're an inspiration to so many people. Let's flip to a person who's not quite so much of an old duck, and I'm saying that because I'm older than Shelley, so there you go. But what about a young duck, Emily? You're at a different career stage than Shelley and I. So tell us about you and bias.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for having me here. So my background is in football as well. Well, predominantly football. And I've been coaching the game for about, I think it's 11 years. I'm coming up now. And I started coaching when I was 15 years old. So I'm 27 now. And you can imagine I started coaching before female football was really a thing, before women were really included in sport, before we had girls teams. There were a few around, but it wasn't as big as what it was back then. If you think that the AFLW's only been around for, I think, maybe 6-7 years now. So when we're talking about bias, I have a story that I share in the podcast, and I'll, sort of summarize it, which that story summarizes my experiences as a female coach in sport. I went back to coach at community level last year. So I have started my coaching career in community, and then I coached internationally in Germany, and then I'm in the NAB League now, which is under 18s, the semi-elite pathway. Jumped back into community level, and we had a club function. And I was hanging out with the club president. I didn't know very many people, and I was just sort of, getting to know everyone. And I ended up having a conversation with him and a fellow coach of one of the senior men's teams. And within a minute of being introduced to this coach in particular, he then went straight into telling me about, how to coach, the fact that I should go and shadow the senior head coach because he's the best coach that, this coach had ever seen. And we just proceeded to tell me all about these things that he found really important about coaching, which is fine. I can see maybe why he'd like to share that, but just keeping in mind that this was literally within a minute of meeting me. And, I sat there, I was nodding my head, just agreeing with what he was saying. And after what felt like about 10 minutes, I go, do you know anything about me? He didn't bother to ask a question, didn't ask about any of my experiences. And he just abruptly was like, nah. And I was like, cool, no worries. And the president just shook his head and he's like, you need to shut up right now. And, I share that story because this is an unconscious bias that a lot of male coaches or male leaders have had within the, particularly the football space that I've experienced, is that I'm constantly being told what I need to do or what I need to learn or how I should coach in particular. And, it's really affected my confidence levels in developing my own coaching style, which really how I face up in the footy world is very different to how male coaches face up. I coach boys at the moment, and I'm still very much about relationships and getting to know all of my players and really putting that first. And it may seem like, I'm just that's the way that females coach, but genuinely I reckon I get the best out of my players more than anyone else. And I've never been taught that. And so it's funny, I get told all these things, but none of it actually is really aligned with my style or, how I show up in the footy world. So that's pretty much a summary of my history in sport, Michelle.
I find it really fascinating. So Emily busts a whole lot of barriers. So I first met Emily when she pinged me an email. I think she was still in Europe at the time and said, hey, this is who I am. This is what my goal is in life. You seem to be someone who can help me get there. Can I meet with you when I get back to Australia? And I went, I've never been asked such a direct question. This is bloody awesome. Away we went. So a few years down the track. But when you talk about we talk about authentic leadership and heart-based leadership and servant leadership and some other, corporate babble. Don't mean to be disrespectful, but you're doing what two of the greats in the AFL had to get sent to Harvard to learn, one of them being Nathan Buckley. And for those of you who've watched the Collingwood story, the doco on Nathan Buckley's transformation as a coach, you'll see exactly what Emily was talking about, the fact that he went from being a hard man to how do I embrace the relationships and the heart-led stuff. And, I think the results speak for themselves. And you know, Richmond Footy Club have also been the beneficiary of a transformation of a senior male coach in line with that philosophy. So there's a lot to learn, and I think the call out there is to not assume that a young person isn't mature. Not assume that a young person hasn't got experience, and how we might learn from that young person. Emily sometimes introduces me as her mentor, and I introduce her as mine, because she keeps me real and keeps me very informed about what I need to be on the lookout for as well. So Hannah and Alison, both of you, you are in different sports. So Han, you're a much awarded Paralympian. Alison, you are the first female president of an elite cricket club. And so arguably, someone could look at both of you and go, well, you've made it, so you must have done all this right. So, and I know that you've had experiences, and I know, Alison, you had one just recently. But how have you navigated? So I guess this is the women on the call, and men, but the women on the call are saying, well, that's great. All I'm hearing is about problems. How have these women been successful? How have they identified the barriers or the bias, and how have they navigated it? What would be your advice? Han, I'll throw to you first.
Thanks, Michelle, and so happy to be with you all tonight. So navigating bias, I think, is a really fascinating topic, and probably one that we all might be lifelong learners in. Personally, for me, how I have navigated bias over about the past 15 years or so is, I remember I was going through a rehab period in my life after having 2 hip surgeries. In a really big nutshell, I was an elite swimmer for 10 years and got to travel the world with the swimming team, went to the Paralympic Games, got a Paralympic medal, world records, ticked all the boxes. We traveled literally everywhere except Antarctica. So that's still on the to-do list. And I got quite burnt out from following the black line from such a young age and transferred into the sport of cycling. And cycling is my heart space, my passion. I absolutely love it. However, I wasn't quite built for cycling, in that the theory is, when I was a little bit younger, being an amputee and doing a lot of hopping, I put down some extra bone on the head of my left femur, which is my strong leg, my Brutus. Whereas my Julius Caesar, so my amputee side, he's known as, we refer to him as Julius Caesar. So Brutus had a little bit too much bone. And after doing 8 months of conservative rehab, I had hip surgeries, was in a very dark place from being taken away from sport, my friends, connections, all of those things for so long. And so working with a sports psych, I didn't realize it at the time, but I remember vividly sitting in the Victorian Institute of Sport gym, which, you know, has all of the smells that a gym has. So sweat, the wooden floorboards, and it was in winter, so it was quite cold as well. But just sitting there, and she's like, okay, Han, so what are 5 things you can see right now? And so I'm like, oh, well, I can see a gym and I can see a light. And because I'd literally just been in the middle of telling her all of these depressive thoughts that I'd been having. And she's like, okay, and now what are 4 things that you can hear? And so I'm like, okay, well, I can hear some athletes in the pool next door, and I can hear the music in the main gym, the sound of the weights pumping, etc. And she's like, okay, and what are 3 things you can feel right now? I'm like, okay, well, I can feel my clothes. And 2 things you can smell. I'm like, well, all of those things I listed before. And 1 thing you can taste. I'm like, just my saliva, really. And so while I didn't know it at the time, that was my first basic introduction to this now quite well-known topic of mindfulness. And building upon that and using it as a way to live life. I don't think we can be mindful all the time. We do have that autopilot for a reason, which is very, very helpful. But for my personal journey and to navigate that bias, to become aware of it, that has been a really big part of the journey and a tool that I can use, and one that I will be using for the rest of my life. So if I could encourage everyone who is on this call right now to, if you can, grab a pen and paper. You can bring out your phones if you really have to, but I would love if you could bring out just a pen and paper, and on a blank piece of paper, write down the word woman, and then just spend literally the next 30 seconds writing down associations you have with that word. So if you can go for it now, because I've got my clock counting down, you're probably down to about 20 seconds now of writing down any words that come up that you associate with the word woman. And as you're just finishing off that exercise, you might like to keep going as we keep talking, because other things may come up for you. It's interesting to find what people associate with the word. And that can change over time as we change our thoughts and our schemas, etc. But it can be a really powerful place for everyone on this call to start having some conversations. So these are my biases that I have. These are my associations that I have. What are yours? So I would just recommend that as one way to start breaking down those biases.
Well, there you go. There's an exercise that I'm going to use probably with some of my clients. If you're on the call, look out, because I think that's absolutely terrific. Being able to stop and reflect on how we walk through life is such a powerful part of learning about others. And, you know, the word privilege is something that was thrown at me in a very pejorative way a number of years ago. And I took it in a very pejorative way. I took it as that, well, I'm not privileged because I've had to work hard for everything that I've done, yada, 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 until someone said, actually, you want to check your privilege, Michelle. I think you need to work out what I'm really talking about here. And I went, oh, well, right, then I will. And of course I did. And I went, oh, crap. Okay, so I'm a knob and now I need to check my privilege. And I think that exercise is a way to not only say so, and I would say, you know, if you look at on the screen right now, so there's the beautiful Shelley and the not quite as beautiful Michelle next door to each other of a similar age. You know, we've got many shared experiences, but I walk through life with far fewer barriers than Shelley does, simply because of the colour of our skin, and that's an accident of birth, and that's checking your privilege. So what might I have automatically granted to me that Shelley doesn't, or that Han doesn't because she identifies as disabled, so on and so forth. But I think examining what do I associate with the word woman, and how does that then, you know, our mindsets form our thoughts and our feelings, which dictate our actions, and our actions have consequences. And the consequences are in those graphs or those numbers that we saw earlier. So if I think woman, canteen, woman, washing footy jumpers, woman, ferrying kids to sport, and I think man, CEO, man, board director, that's how it plays out. I love that exercise. Thank you, Han. Great advice. Alison, so you ascended to the presidency of Strathmore Cricket Club a few years back. First woman in how many years? How old is the club?
50 this year. 50.
There you go.
This year.
So, what did you navigate, and how did you navigate it? Because you've been extraordinarily successful in that role, and you've got the facts and the data to back that up. But as a woman, how did you do it?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for having me. And it's a privilege to be on the call with some amazing ladies tonight. How did I do it? There were times where I thought I couldn't. There were times I thought I've got no idea what I'm doing here. I came into the role as the first female president, but I also came into the role in a family that's got a really strong history in our club. A dad who was president, a dad who was a life member, a brother who had won club championship awards, and people expected me to be just like them. So I had 2 rules when I first took on the role. One was, don't refer to me as the first female president, because gender's got nothing to do with it. Second, judge me on my own skills and capability, not am I as good as my dad? Am I the same as my brother? And I've changed my thoughts on that now. And I did touch on that when we recorded our session, Michelle. Absolutely, I tell everyone I'm the first female president, and I embrace it and I love it, because I use that with our junior girls that play, and I say to them, you know what, I was your age. Actually, I was younger. I was 3 when my parents first took me to that club. And as a 10 and 11-year-old, I didn't get to play cricket. In actual fact, I can't play cricket. I can play one shot in the backyard and the ball always went through the window. So I got told off for doing that as well.
Fix them out.
One shot. But, you know, I embrace it now for those young girls to see what sport can give you and what especially community-based sport can give you. I have had lots of bias thrown at me, and yes, I did have one only a week or 2 ago that I think it got me in a minute of anger. I posted on Michelle's LinkedIn post about questioning why some people thought it was appropriate to BYO alcohol into our club. When I say people, men. And I had a conversation with them about the issues around that. And one of the guys turned around to my partner and said, mate, can you just take her home and make her happy? And he said that as I walked out the door. But I tell you what, I turned on my heels pretty quick smart and I walked back in there. And these are men, middle-aged men. And I said, you know what? It's not about making me happy. It's about providing a fair space for everyone, because everyone's paying full price for drinks over the bar. And I've learnt how to do that over the time. I know as soon as I turned and walked back out, they'd be mouthing off. But it's about creating an environment where I'm about everyone and I'm about creating a fair, equal space. I learnt very early on, this is my 4th year as being president, I learnt very early on not to try and fight the guys, but to bring them on the journey with me. And I tapped into their knowledge and their experience. I worked out very quickly which ones are always going to be having a mouth off. And you know what? You get that in life, whether it's sport, business, wherever, you park those people. Then there's the people that do want to have a bit of a chat, but they want to be heard. So I'd go and talk to them. I almost, in my first year, I don't know if I should admit it, but I embraced my dumb female status. Oh, can you help me? I don't know how to do this. Can you tell me what to do? Probably not politically correct, but I tell you what, it gave them a sense of importance. It gave them a sense of belonging, that I wasn't here to change their club or our club. I was here to make it better. And it's funny, those men now, they're my biggest supporters. And if we talk about how to navigate bias, go and get yourself a supporter or supporters, regardless of what level you're working or playing or coaching. And, you know, Emily, listening to your story, I'm sitting there going, I've been there. Yep, But I think to lead with heart and to lead with love, as women, we quite often, I think, get tarred with the brush. Oh, you're being overly emotional. Actually, no, I'm not. I genuinely love and I am passionate about the message that I'm driving or the people that I'm working with. And it's okay to teach the guys that our difference in opinion or the difference in the way we do things is okay, because together we get an amazing outcome. And, you know, I've got some little notes here. Take men on the journey. Cliche as it sounds, we've got to take them on this journey, because Michelle's right and the data doesn't lie. They are in those powers of position at the moment. So unless we work with that to our advantage, nothing's going to change. Create your own opportunities, have your own voice, but you are going to need those supporters. There are times that I've come home and sat on the couch and burst into tears and said to my partner, I'm not doing this anymore. I give up. And he's like, yeah, right, you'll get up tomorrow and you'll come up with another bright idea. So, but, it's really about, having those supporters, having those people that you can vent to, having those people that will have your back when you're not in that room.
Mm.
And, I've just had to, that's what I've done for the last few years.
So some very strong, a couple of very strong pieces of advice there and call to actions. Number one, bring men on the journey. And yes, that's we can't not. So men on the call, we want you on the journey, and we want you to embrace your vulnerability and your courageous vulnerability and say, I don't know all the answers. And then the second part is, let's celebrate our differences, because unleash the power of diversity. If we're just assembling numbers, different folks, all we're doing is assembling numbers. We're not actually unleashing the power of diversity. So inclusion does that. But the cheer squad, having your own cheer squad, and so I can say that the first interview off the first cab off the rank next week is with Lisa Alexander. Now, Lisa Alexander, for those of you who don't know, Lisa is one of our most successful elite coaches ever in Australia. She's now in London coaching and a director with the London Pulse Netball Association or netball organisation. And in her interview, she reminded me of just how important it is when you are that person out the front. So Shelley, when you were at the front and calling out the misogyny, when you were calling out racism, you had to have those people around you, your cheer squad, your cheer squad. And Lisa reminded me of how important it is for us. Resilience just doesn't mean sticking your head above the parapet every day over and over again to get a whack. It means, how do you top up your reserves? And part of that, your advice, Alison, is saying, who's my cheer squad? How do I, get back my joie de vivre and my energy and what have you from them? But also, who do I feel safe with? And I don't think we can underestimate the power of people feeling safe, because when you feel safe, you're going to share the stuff that makes you great. So really great advice, Alison. Now, good segue. Thank you, Alison and Han. Always unexpected but terrific advice. International Women's Day is about celebrating women. Now, I want 365 days a year to be about celebrating women, because my goal is to live in a world where women are as celebrated and as valued and as respected as men are. So, one day a year just is, I'm calling BS on it. It's not enough. However, it's a nice way to say, okay, let's make everyone in the world stop for one day and say, who the bloody hell are we going to celebrate? So back to you, ladies. Who's a woman that you're celebrating and why? Because I really, we've got to amplify women's voices. I'm going to kick off with Emily. Who are you celebrating? Which woman and why?
So I hadn't even thought of this question, Michelle, and I almost feel like it's been sprung upon me. But most recently, so I've joined Eastern Rangers, which is the NAB League, like I mentioned before. And there's another woman that is coaching in the under-18s in the girls comp. And I know her by the name of LJ, and she used to play AFLW. Michelle, do you know who LJ is?
I don't know.
No.
But I might.
You should
old.
get on to it.
Yeah, I know. Face name.
That's okay. She is one of the best football coaches that I have seen. And she's just taken on a coach developer role for the women coaches in the VAFA. She has coached at AFLW level, obviously because she's had the experience as a player. And I now have someone to look up to that's actually within reach to actually be mentored by. And I have never had that in my 11 years of coaching. So I'm going to be celebrating LJ from Eastern Rangers.
Outstanding. Good on you, LJ. And, sometimes, LJ may not be even aware of the impact that she's had on you. So I'm super pleased that you've given her that shout out. Han, what about you?
Thanks, Michelle. This is getting me excited about all of these amazing women and just to be here with the rest of you too. So I am celebrating my crazy talented housemate, Britt Cox, who has just come back from her 4th Winter Olympic Games in freestyle mogul skiing. It's nuts. If anybody doesn't know what this sport is, it's essentially they start at the top of the mountain. They have these little bumps that they then ski down. They do a flip off a jump. They do have some more bumps. They have another jump, and then they finish after a few more bumps. Crazy stuff. So not only is it her 4th games, but she made the finals for the 4th time. She's only 27. And I think for me, she's such a wise soul and the most generous person. She is really, like, one of her goals is to motivate and inspire the next generation of female mogul skiers, to help provide a role model for them, because she was lacking that at her time. We've had some amazing Winter Olympic female athletes, I will say, who I know have been role models. So she's kind of taking that step into the next generation. So I think more importantly, yes, she is a crazy, amazing athlete. Just as importantly, she has the world's biggest heart. We have a lot of deep and meaningful conversations out on our deck as roommates now. We started off not really knowing each other, and now kind of 3.5 years later, we've gone from not knowing each other to being best friends. And I can't imagine my life without her. And we were talking about supporters before, and she's been one of my biggest supporters. She's had my back through, for example, not qualifying for Tokyo last year, and the recent surgery I had where I chopped some of my leg off just for giggles. The rehab's still going on. But she also gives the best hugs. So for all of those reasons and more, I could speak for another few hours, but I will leave it there. Brit Cox is the female and woman in sport that I am celebrating.
Well, I tell you what, my wife is a mad Winter Olympics fan, and at those moguls, I just look and I go, when do they go back and pick up their hips and their knees? Because holy moly, man, that's full on. So good on you, Britt, and good on you for being part of your crew as well. And Shelley, which woman are you celebrating?
So Hannah, her name is Lauren Moorcroft, the lady. Yeah, the coach that you're talking about. So Lauren Moorcroft, LJ, that's who you're referring to. So my person that I'm actually celebrating is Darcy Vescio. Darcy Vescio plays AFLW for the Carlton Football Club, and they became the first AFLW player to reach a 50-goal milestone from 47 AFLW games. So it was a big milestone that was actually achieved just on the weekend. So I have to say I am a Carlton fan, but I'm also a Darcy Vescio fan. But I think they've been absolutely amazing this year. This year, Darcy, through a lot of tears and a lot of fear, actually made a public announcement that they were non-binary. And I think through the tears and the fear that they showed, it created a space for other people to feel safe to come forward. And it breaks my heart that we are still needing to have people cry and people have fear about saying who they truly are as a person and how they walk this earth. And I look forward to the day and the space that Darcy has created for others to come forward and not have to make a teary public announcement, but just to live and be who they are as a person. So I'm very proud of they, and I celebrate Darcy Vescio.
What an absolutely terrific person to celebrate. And Darcy is certainly someone that I admire a lot. And I agree, Shelley, I hope that there's a day when no one has to come out once or repeatedly, as so many people in the rainbow community have to. It's not just once, it's over and over and over again. And it's been very interesting to hear the evolution of football commentating, because we have two non-binary folks in the AFLW, and people are going to get it wrong from time to time, but it's been very, very helpful, I think, and useful to hear football commentators starting to refer to people by their correct pronouns. But Darcy, what a hero of mine they are too. Al, last but not least, which woman are you celebrating and why?
I'm actually celebrating 10 young women.
Oh,
I'm celebrating.
Overachiever.
Sorry, I break the rules quite often. I am celebrating my under 12 girls cricket side who won their first ever premiership last season, who created history at our cricket club. And I had the privilege of getting to go and talk to them throughout the season and giving them a bit of a chat and telling them how exciting it was, and that they actually didn't even understand what history they were creating. And to see them on their little grand final day or grand final night, it still makes me a bit emotional. They were just out there having fun. There was no question about, am I a boy? Am I a girl? Am I playing boys sport, girls sport? I'm out there having fun. And I think that will pave the way, in years to come. I can't wait till we don't refer to girls cricket, girls football, boy, because we don't say boys under 12s. We say the girls under 12 side. And I think to bring these girls together, 3 years earlier, I had 3 little girls that wanted to play cricket, and they were the little girls whose brothers were out there. So they got dragged along and we're like, hey, do you want to have a go? Fast forward to this season, a number of them have all played rep cricket. They've represented their associations and our areas. And again, they're just out there having a crack. And I think if there's something that we can learn from that is just give them the opportunity, provide the level playing space, and girls will generally take it and run with it. And, so I'm celebrating those young girls of our club who, hopefully in a few years' time will have a senior women's side and they can look back after 30 plus years of being at the club. Well, actually, I'm being generous. Who am I kidding? 40 plus years at our club that I've been there. They'll get to look back and say, hey, I helped those girls. And so, yeah, they're my little champions.
And they won't know. They won't ever know the impact that they've had, because trailblazers often don't until someone tells them further down the track. So I'm so glad that you're celebrating those young, those girls, those young women who are setting an example for others. Hannah, I know you're curious about something. What would you like to ask?
I am. Thanks, Michelle. Just really quickly. So I come from a disability inclusion space, and in that space we use person first language. So athlete with a disability, etc. And so, Shelley, I was just really curious. In the conversation we were having before, we were generally saying Aboriginal person, or we say First Nations peoples. Is there a preference, do you think, within that arena for the language that we use? Because I'm a believer that language is really, really powerful. I think you're on mute.
There she is. She's unmuted now.
I'm so 2020, so that's what old people do. So, but it is a really, really important question. So thank you for asking that. We're the Aboriginal people. I prefer to be called Aboriginal. You will find that Aborigine a lot of people don't tend to like that because it has a lot of connotations, like derogative connotations to it. Indigenous was sort of something the government came up with, and some, like my son in his generation, he doesn't mind being called Indigenous. And now we're called First Nations, which used to be what they used to call galleries. And like they used to have a government paper, we would be noted as First Nations peoples. So it is really, really important if you're in the company of a First Nations person or you're about to introduce them or speak to them, that you actually ask them like what their preference is, because it is quite wide and it often is generational. where I still prefer to be called Aboriginal, and I do find that a lot of people still prefer to be called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. But I think the government, it became too difficult to write Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, so they came up with a few options. Is always my sort of way of thinking about it, because I have been called a lot of things in my years. So I've stuck with Aboriginal, but thanks for asking.
Very, very good question. And you're right, Han and Shelley, that language matters. It matters for Aboriginal people, for non-binary people, for all of us. And I think curiosity and empathy can't be underestimated as two powerful, powerful traits or attributes to use when you're trying to create a more inclusive sporting or business, a more inclusive environment, full stop. And being genuinely curious and respectful to say, how would you prefer to be addressed? Or, for example, I did a panel a couple of weeks ago and I spelled out a very important woman who's Sri Lankan, and she had a very long name, so I spelled it out phonetically, and I said to her, is this the way that you spell, I beg your pardon, you pronounce your name, and can I say it out loud to practice it? And she goes, oh, that's really good, thank you so much for asking. And I did end up fluffing out a little bit, but I said, I'm so sorry. She said, that's fine, because she wanted to be asked. So I think for all of us being vulnerable enough to say, how would you like that? I think it's a great question. Hey, I'm very, very conscious that, as always, we could talk for hours, but we only have a couple of minutes left. So, folks, thank you so much for those of you who have commented. Many of you have asked where you can get stuff. MichelleRedfern.com. Just go there or on my socials, and everything will be there. You'll be so sick of me by the end of this year, because you'll have lots of stuff to look at. And thank you so much for the kind comments from our viewers who are congratulating the panel on their questions and their responses. I'm going to throw to my mysterious Ben, my partner in crime who no one can see, to take us out with, just a little bit of promo to say where you can get hold of the Advancing Women in Sport podcast, and also just a little bit more about what we're doing. But my call to action is, as I gave some advice on LinkedIn, what are the things I should do, Michelle, to get serious about, levelling the playing field for women? Number 1, get informed. Number 2, get vulnerable. Number 3, get started. There is no wrong place to start. So please get informed, get vulnerable, as we've talked about tonight, and get started. So, folks, thank you, Shelley, Alison, Han and Emily, and of course thank you to all of the other guests on the Advancing Women in Sport podcast, whose stories you will hear, because, as we said, there are women's lived experience beyond the statistics. And when you learn that, as well as the statistics, when you go beyond the statistics, together we can all close the gender gap in sport. So thanks for tuning in, and, well, I'll see you on the flip side.